Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Becoming Human Again, an oral history of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi with Donald Miller, Lorna, Touryan-Miller, and Arpi Miller. My name is Megan Reed and I'm the operations coordinator for the Zorin Institute, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. This is the fourth session of Zorin Institute's third consecutive Genocide and Human Rights webinar series. These five-part series are hosted by talented scholars and specialists in the field and cover a wide range of conceptual themes and specific case studies of genocide. The best part is these webinars are open and accessible to the public, and you can tune in from the comfort of your own home. In addition to today's highly anticipated session, we have one other must-see webinar coming up next week titled Gender and International Responses to Genocide with Grant Shubin of the Global Justice Center. My colleague Jenna will be sharing the webpage to learn more about this upcoming session and to register for the next session. So look out for that in the chat box. And a few housekeeping items before I give our hosts today a proper introduction. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box or raise your hand to ask a question out loud and I can unmute you so you can ask your question. There will be a Q&A period at the end of today's presentation to ask any questions you have. And if you have any specific questions for the Institute, you're welcome to send me an email to admin@genocidestudies.org. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Donald E. Miller is the Leonard K. Firestone Professor of Religion at the University of Southern California and Director of Strategic Initiatives at USC's Center for Religion and Civic Culture. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 10 books, including Global Pentecostalism, The New Face of Christian Social Engagement, and Reinventing American Protestantism, Christianity in the New Millennium. Lorna Touryan-Miller is co-author with Donald Miller of the publications Survivors, An Oral History of the Armenian Genocide, and Armenia, Portraits of Survival and Hope. She is the former director of the Office for Creative Connections in Pasadena, California. And Arpi Miller completed her doctoral dissertation in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she focused on the transnational political activism of Salvadoran immigrants in Los Angeles. She is currently involved in immigrant rights issues in Fort Collins, Colorado. So a big welcome to our host this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, good morning to all of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And I know there are a few people who are tuning in internationally. Thank you very much, Megan, for that introduction. And it's a delight to be sharing the next hour or so with all of you. I was actually on the Zorin board sometime back in the 1980s. And that was during a period that Lorna and I were working intensively on this book I'm going to hold up called Survivors, An Oral History of the Armenian Genocide. And my favorite memory actually of the Zorin Institute was going to Greg Sarkisian's home. And I had the honor of making the Armenian coffee and serving it to the board members and other friends who were there. I also want to say that the Zorin Institute was one of the pioneers in interviewing by video survivors of the Armenian Genocide. And I think you now have nearly 700 interviews, maybe even more. They've all been digitized. I think some of them are also being transcribed. It's an amazing collection. And Lorna's two parents are actually in that collection. Her father, of a family of 9, only he and a sister survived. And her mother's interview is also in that collection. So in the 1980s, Lorna and I were working Actually, Lorna was doing a lot of the work because she was doing the interviewing, and she interviewed a few over 100 elderly survivors of the Armenian Genocide. And then I got tasked with actually doing the writing for that book. And I really want to credit my father-in-law, Vahram Touryan, for inspiring me personally to be interested in genocide. And then in the 1990s, Lorna and I got very involved in the Republic of Armenia. It led to the publication of another book I'm holding up here called Armenia Portraits of Survival and Hope. And we worked with a team of graduate students in Yerevan who did about 300 interviews, actually a few more. And there were different populations. There were the earthquake survivors from 1988, a project that I know the Zorian Institute worked on, which we also interviewed individuals who survived the pogroms or the massacres in Sumgait and Baku in 1988 and 1990. And then also our team did a lot of interviewing in Artsakh. This was back in the early 1990s, and Lorna and I traveled extensively to Armenia during what were oftentimes called the Dark Ages. This was the period when there was a major blockade against Armenia. Well, that takes us to the 2000s. And Lorna's going to tell you a little bit about how we launched the project that focused on interviewing survivors of the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis. But just a little bit of context, I think it's important to locate where Rwanda is. It's very close to the equator in Africa. It is surrounded by Uganda, the Congo, Tanzania, and Burundi. It's a very small country, actually. At the time of the genocide, there were probably 6 or 7 million people. So Lorna, tell us how this project got launched that then has been evolving over almost 20 years.
There was a conference that was held in 2001 in Kigali. This was partly with the government of Rwanda, as well as some scholars in genocide work. And the idea was to invite survivors and scholars of genocide from the different genocides of the 20th century. We were invited representing the Armenians, and while the Armenian survivors themselves were very elderly, I was the next person to a survivor, being the child of 2 survivors. So the conference lasted a whole week. Actually, we stayed 2 weeks there because we got to know some of the people. And the very first session was a panel of survivors to tell their stories. I, of course, told the story of my father, what he went through, how he survived. And each subsequent survivors told their stories. After that particular session, a group of young people, maybe 3 or 4, came up to me and to Don, and something about my father's story had really resonated with them. And they felt that I might really understand their stories and what they went through. And they were all orphans, by the way. They were the leadership of an organization they had put together called AOCM. It's in French, but basically it says Orphan Heads of Households. And they felt that their needs were very unique from either adults, in that not only were they orphaned, but they were tasked raising younger siblings. And in some cases, they were raising neighbor kids who had lost everyone. And so they were very eager to tell us their story and to get acquainted with some of their peers. And we spent lots of time with them informally. They would tell us bits and pieces of their story, but they made a point of inviting us to one of the homes of a young woman to sit down and actually tell her whole story. And so they arranged for a cab to take us there. But of course, the car could only travel so far. There was a deep, very steep hill we had to go down that was muddy, running water on both sides. We went down and into this little tiny room where there's this really young, lovely woman, very nervous, but she was been told that it's important she tells us her story. Her name was Claudine, and she sat down with tears and sometimes laughter, giddiness, told us her lovely story. At one point, she stopped and she asked her younger siblings to leave the room. At first, we couldn't quite what she was doing, and then it became very clear was the time when she described painfully the rape. After that, the conference organizers took us to many of the sites in Rwanda, basically memorials. And one of them was really the most excruciating thing, where we've gone several times since, Murambi. It's a school where every classroom has benches with skeletons on it of survivors. And when we went there, these orphans insisted on being in the same van that we were in, and they accompanied us as we went from room to room. Particularly Claudine kept hanging on to me. And it was traumatic enough for Dawn and me to go through something like this we had never seen before. But only afterwards, when these kids really broke down, particularly Claudine, I realized she was hanging on to me because she needed me as support. So that was the launch into knowing what the genocide was going to teach us. And we couldn't leave these kids behind when we went home. We said, we've got to stay in touch. And we had a grant that a friend had given us to use for any kind of project we wanted. So we knew exactly what we wanted to do, because they were at this conference really emphasizing the importance of documenting stories before it gets too late. And so we thought maybe these kids could document stories of their peers in AOCM. And so we wrote to them. They were very excited. They sent a proposal and a budget, and we went back with the equipment that they would need for our interviewing, transcribing, translating, and so forth. They had a team of 10, very organized. They were university students at this point. And we trained them. They interviewed each other, and we left them. And they said, well, in 3 months, we'll send you everything. It took 8 months, but believe it or not, we got 100 interviews, transcribed, translated, with horrendous stories. And so that launched us into the next 20 years, but we could not leave Rwanda, had to keep going back.
So in just a moment, Arpi is going to tell us a bit about her role in this project and also her experience of traveling to Rwanda. But let me say a few methodological things. I'll try to not make this boring. But the book that we wrote, I'll hold it up here for you. And by the way, it's available for, I think, about $25 on Amazon. But this is not a pitch to buy the book. It's just if you get interested in this genocide, it is available. But we actually ended up working with 3 different organizations. One was the Orphan Association that Lorna just mentioned. And I want to give you a couple of statistics related to that organization. So while it had a few thousand members, as Lorna said, they interviewed 100 of their own members, and they did a bit of a database. There were about 800 family members of those 100 orphans, and about 65% of those family members were killed during the genocide. So I'm mentioning that just so you get an idea of the devastation of the genocide. 25 out of the 100 orphans experienced some kind of really serious injury, and 80 of those 100 orphans, their homes were destroyed. And that's actually very important in terms of understanding the devastation that occurred. The next group that that were interviewed. Actually, it was a group of widows who had formed an organization called Avega. And they were, I think, maybe a little jealous that the orphans had a project documenting their experiences. And so we again found some funding to support their project. They did 60 interviews. And let me give you a couple of statistics from them. Out of those 60 people who were interviewed, there were 389 family members, and just under 50% of those family members were killed. Out of the 55 women who were interviewed, because there were actually a few men who were also included in their sample, 22 of them had been raped, and many of them had been raped multiple times. And Lorna is going to say more about that. And not all had been tested for HIV, but 9 of those who had been tested were HIV positive. And about half of the individuals interviewed in that project had a serious injury. That included amputations, actually, because a lot of the killing was done with machetes, or what were in the language, local language, called pungas. And then there was a third population, and Lorna will say much more about this, but we then did 100 videotaped interviews at an organization. It was a local organization called Soulless Ministries. So just a couple of other things. One is a colleague of mine at the University of Southern California joined us about midway in the project, Beth Meyerowitz. And she did some very statistically oriented research on the first 2 groups that I just, actually, it was AOCM, the Orphan Group, and the Soulless Ministries individuals that were interviewed. And Appendix 2 of our book has a lot of her findings, more statistical in nature. And then also, we took a photographer with us, and we produced a really beautiful book on orphans. And we had an exhibit that traveled all around Los Angeles. We estimated about 20,000 people saw it. And so I'm just mentioning that because I think visual representations are also very important. And then if any of you would be interested in seeing some examples of videotape interviews, there are maybe about 50 of these, and they're just short clips on a website by the Pomegranate Foundation. And the website is simply Pomegranate Foundation, all one word, .org. And within that, you'll find the section on Rwanda. Okay, so Arpi, tell us about your involvement and your trip in 2006 to Rwanda.
Sure, thanks. So just for a little context, this is, I think, the 3rd of 4 book projects that we've worked on intergenerationally. So this is not a new experience for us. This is a thing that we've been doing for a while. And I think on a lot of levels, the most personal project because of our family's own history with genocide. So some of my reflections are going to personalize this a little bit. My role for this book was really not to be involved in the interview process, but to do a lot of the poring over the transcripts, helping with analysis and some of the writing of the book. And I don't think it was said yet, but we worked on this book for years. We have lived with this material from the moment of the interviews and the first visits to Rwanda to the final drafts for a decade or so. I wanted to say a few words about my experience of visiting Rwanda as the grandchild of survivors of the Armenian Genocide. One, it personalizes it because as outsiders go in and interview in a context, it's important to understand that there actually is more of a kindred connection in this particular project, even though we're not Rwandan. We share a history together. Also to draw some connections between genocides in different contexts. The first thing to say, I traveled to Rwanda in 2006, so just over 20 years after the genocide. One thing to say, no, I'm saying that wrong, less than 20 years. 2006 would have been just 10 years, just about 12 years, I guess. One thing to say is the Rwandans know so much about the Armenian genocide. And I found that super striking. They're very connected internationally to genocides and massacres that have occurred in other places and very educated about it. So one of their largest genocide memorials is in Kigali. And that memorial, as you walk through it, I was really struck in 2006 that you walk through the experience of the unfolding of the Rwanda genocide, but as you get to the end of that, you walk right into the Armenian genocide, and there's quite an extensive section. And so this meeting one another, and when we would say we're the children and grandchildren of survivors of the Armenian genocide, people knew what that meant right away. The second thing to say is that it really was like an experience of walking into history for us as a family. So this is almost like the sensation of walking the earth in historic Armenia for us, coming across the bones of our ancestors. It would have been like the sensation of walking the earth in that region, in 1925 or so. And we traveled also with a friend of ours, Father Boscan, and we kept sharing the experience of this is like going back, this is like stepping back in time and seeing what that would have been like. There's one particular memorial called Nitrama that's a very moving memorial in the way that at the time I visited, it was untouched. It's a church. And as you step into the church, it's since been cleaned up quite a bit. So they've sort of changed the way that it looks. But as you step into the church, there are sort of bookshelves that have different sized skulls that are the skulls of the people that were killed in that space. And as you step into the sanctuary, the remains were left exactly as the genocide unfolded. And so what you have is not only bones and clothing in the pews and on the floor, but all the items people escaped with. So it's very clear that people were going there with the thought that they would survive, and they would sort of bunker down there for a few days, cooking materials, homework, brushes, and things like that. And I found that incredibly moving, because as the grandchild of survivors, is sort of like, this is where it happened, and this is how it happens. There was also the sensation of as I would meet survivors, of for me stepping into the past and feeling like this is my grandfather at 18, right after he was emancipated from the orphanage, not long after. And as he was beginning to start a new life, figure out economically how he was going to survive, meet his spouse and start that new life. So it was that moment of meeting those survivors, those orphans in that moment. And for them, they kept saying that meeting me was like looking into the future. It was like, this is what it looks like in 2 generations. And I was really moved by the way the women particularly would just grab and hug me when they learned that I was the grandchild of survivors, because it was almost like, an image of hope, like life will go on. There will be generations after this. And so it was an incredibly moving experience working on this book, and very personal, but also a really moving experience to be in that space and meet those survivors.
One thing that Arpi just mentioned, and I think it's very important, the estimates are that literally half of the Tutsis who were killed in Rwanda died in churches. And so in the Armenian case, people actually oftentimes fled to churches as a place of protection. And in previous massacres against the Tutsis in Rwanda, they also had gone to churches as a place of protection. But almost the opposite occurred. It was actually a way in which the killers could enter churches and more efficiently do their killing. Now, chapter 2 of this book gives a fairly in-depth history of how the genocide happened, and there are a lot of footnotes actually in that chapter. And we would take all of our time if I just sort of focused on the history of the genocide. So instead, I want to just give you some big contextual things, as then Lorna next is going to talk about the experience of women that she interviewed. So the genocide occurred in 1994. At that time, there were probably 6 or 7 million people who lived in this rather small, highly densely populated country. About 15% were Tutsis. They were the minority. They were the focus of extermination. About 85% were Hutus and about 1% were Twa. I think it's very important to say that in this genocide, it was Christians killing Christians. Actually, maybe only 5%, even less, of the population in Rwanda were Muslims. And interestingly, they by and large did not participate in the genocide. The Catholic Church played a very substantial role in supporting the genocide. And I think it is fair to say, had clergy stood up against the genocide, it might not have even occurred. But instead, there were some highly placed clergy who were actually involved in the very planning of the extermination process. The current government, let me just say a little bit about that. The president is Paul Kagame. He was actually the leader of the rebel force that stopped the genocide on July 15th, 1994. The country currently, and I'm saying this because I don't want you to have any false impressions of its state in 2021. In my experience, and I've traveled extensively all over Africa, it is the safest, most secure country that one can travel in. And I invite you to go see the gorillas and see the land of 1,000 hills. There's also an incredible emphasis on cleanliness in the country. You cannot take any kind of plastic bag into the country. It has enjoyed a fairly substantial positive rate of economic expansion, averaging 7 to 8% since the genocide. But nevertheless, about 40% of the population lives under the poverty line. Just a couple more important things. The genocide occurred during a civil war that started in 1990, and then the genocide really was launched on April 6th in 1994. There's every indication it was a premeditated genocide by the leaders of the Hutu power movement. The killing, as I mentioned earlier, was done oftentimes with very crude, almost agricultural instruments, machetes. Also, there was some killing that was done with rifles and other weapons of war, but a lot of the killing was done by the militia, what was referred to as the Interahamwe. These were sort of young thugs that were commissioned by the government. But it's also very important to say that neighbors killed neighbors. And even though Hutus and Tutsis were living in a very intermixed way, Hutu neighbors were inflamed by propaganda, and they killed following orders, because if they did not kill their Tutsi neighbors, they were subject to be killed themselves. And then the very last thing I'll say is that definitely this particular genocide in some ways was the result of colonial influence. After the First World War, the League of Nations gave Belgium the mandate to oversee Rwanda. They identified the Tutsis as the superior race, even though they were the minority, in part because they looked more European. They were tall and thin. And in 1933, they actually classified everyone, even though there had been intermarriage between Tutsis and Hutus. They were classified as being one of those three ethnic groups. And then by the late 1950s, there was a growing perception, even among the clergy, that this was an unjust situation. And in 1957, there was something called the Hutu Manifesto that led to a rising up politically of the majority population of Hutus. There were extensive killings and massacres of Tutsis beginning in 1959, then again in 1963, again in 1973. So that by 1973, 700,000 Tutsis had fled Rwanda and were living principally in Uganda, but also in Burundi and in some surrounding countries, including some who had fled to Europe. So Lorna, tell us now a bit about the interviewing process, your own experience in doing interviews, and then your perception of women that were interviewed.
Sure. I had spent 15 years of my life earlier interviewing Armenian survivors, transcribing and translating the story. So I knew every single story, everything about every story, and I lived with that for 15 years while raising my young children who were the age of the survivors when they were going through the genocide. So those were really, really dark and depressing years for me. I found myself becoming more and more melancholy. But I also have to say that I was interviewing these survivors 60, 70, 80, sometimes years after the genocide. So while the stories were tragic, heart-wrenching, the people themselves at that age were somewhat settled. They had made it, they had children, they had grandchildren. Financially, they were quite secure. And that was very different from my experience of interviewing survivors of the Rwandan genocide. We began informal interviews starting 7 years after the genocide, up to 15 years. So people were still living the experience of the genocide. Their trauma was very evident in their face and their demeanor, in the way they talked, in the way they would, after we would talk with them, they would sort of go somewhere else. So that was a big point that I hadn't really considered. I thought I was really ready. I could handle any kind of interview, but it turned out to be much more difficult than I had anticipated. There were, doing it informally around drinking coffee or visiting homes is quite different than sitting down and doing a formal interview, which we did 100 of from the same organization. The interviews were done in Kinyarwanda, their mother tongue, and the person who was translating herself is Rwandan, although she had not gone through the genocide. She was one of those people who was in Uganda. And I would always start telling them that I'm also the child of a survivor, and that would help them relax a little bit, like, okay, you understand what we went through. But their body language was really very telling when we were doing the interviews. Don was videotaping and I would do the actual talking. People would come in with visible wounds on their face, on their head, on their different parts of their body. And if it wasn't visible, they would actually show us. One woman just lifted up and showed us her stomach, how it was just completely torn apart and was just hanging there with a piece of skin. And because that was a big part of what they had gone through. Most of the survivors had been injured and for sure had seen brutal killings. Another thing was that sometimes when they were telling the story, they would show absolutely no emotion. We were watching that affect. They would tell the most horrifying story. My mother was killed. She was decapitated. My children were thrown, and no emotion. It's just like they hadn't quite dealt yet with their emotions, or they still were in the middle of being extremely traumatized. Others, of course, would break down, and that was heart-wrenching for us. We would always stop and say, okay, let's stop, let's not do anymore. But they just insisted on telling the story because there was something, they really have the need to tell the story. And I will talk more about that later. And then there many showed PTSD symptoms of flashbacks. That happened several times. I'll give you an example. At one point, we were on the second floor and the roof was tin roof and it started raining. It was absolutely pouring. And this woman just froze. She just froze. She couldn't move. And Donna and I knew that during the genocide, it was the rain season. And so we knew exactly what she was going through. Thankfully, we could just stop and sort of talk about the rain and sort of help her recover. So that was something that I was not prepared for, that I had to live in quickly. Most of these people had heard a lot of propaganda even before the genocide. And the propaganda was always dehumanizing the Tutsis, calling them cockroaches and snakes. And Armenians know well that Armenians were the infidels, they don't deserve to live. And same with the cockroaches. What do you do with cockroaches? You stomp on them to kill them. What do you do with snake? You chop them, you cut them. And as Don said, most of the killing was done brutally by machetes and other instruments. In fact, they would spare the bullets. And many of the survivors said they would beg them to shoot them instead of cutting them with machetes. And finally, there was in this case, and I know it was in the Armenian case, but because so many Armenians I interviewed were children at the time, the issue of rape did not come up except for some older women. In this case, rape was actually one of the instruments of the genocide. It was rampant and it was humiliating, it was degrading, and they did it in the worst possible ways. So that's sort of the context of what we were hearing that was somewhat different from the Armenian. Now, the the group, the 100 people that we interviewed had both orphans and women. I'll just focus a little bit on the women. Arpi will talk about the orphans. They were dealing with multiple issues during the time of the genocide. The men would always first flee because in past genocides, the men were always killed first. So they thought if they leave, the family would have a better chance of survival. So that left the woman with children, sometimes multiple children. And then they had to decide, should they all stay? By the way, they would always flee their houses and hide in the bushes because 63, 73, that's what they would do. The house would be destroyed and they could come back. So that's what they would do. And the mother had to decide, should we all stay together or would the kids have a better chance of survival? And as it turned out, anyone who could walk and run, they felt was better if they would go on their own. And they would keep the babies and the toddlers because they needed to be carried. And so the whole time, not only were they trying to escape and saving their children, feeding the babies that they had, their mind was always on the children. What's happening to the children in the sense that I've left to go on their own. Another thing that Don referred to, many of them had Hutu friends, in fact, married in their families, the neighbors. And they really felt betrayed when they went to them to hide them, to help them. They were normally asked to leave various reasons because the husband had turned to be a killer, the Hutu husband, or they were afraid for their own lives and they simply did not want to keep them. Interestingly, the Hutu people who helped the most were elderly Hutu women. And there were many incidences of that, how they heroically did try to help. Of course, I said rape was rampant. And I think, it's really hard to tell stories, but I'll just mention Mary. I'm just going to call her Mary. just to let you know the kinds of things they were going through genocide. And this is fairly common. And it was, everybody was on her own and his own. It wasn't like, you know, lots of people being deported as with the Armenians. They were on their own. And it was hiding from place to place to place. It could be by the river, it could be in the plantation, it could be going to homes, hoping that someone would take him in and being rejected. And in the case of Mary, she was a rather attractive woman with a baby on her back. Every time the killers would find her, sometimes the Interahamwe way. It's interesting. She would say, they didn't rape me, but they would take me to the soldiers. And I had to really think about that. I think the soldiers were the military, maybe a little more dignified people, and she was a beautiful woman, and she would be raped. And every time they would discover her, they would take her back to others to kill. A soldier, to rape. A soldier would rape and then pass her on to others. She said she lost count after number 11. She went from place to place for 3 months. You can imagine what she was going through. Finally, she ended up in a church, like Don said, thinking that maybe that's a safe place. Wrong. Churches became killing grounds, an easy way to kill hundreds of people. They would throw grenades in, then come in and chop up the rest. And as Don said, many of the priests, unfortunately, these were priests, they were there many times, their own congregants. They were complicit and they would let the killers come in and sometimes even participate. And so when the killing started, Mary fell down on her baby to protect her, and bodies started falling on her and body parts. This went on for a long time. It finally ended. She realized she's still alive. The baby was alive. She got up, went out, went to a close river and washed herself. By that time, the rebel forces had come, so she was saved. Right after the genocide, she was just a mess, just absolute mess. The only way she could survive was drink. And she found her mother. She had a child. She was pregnant, obviously, being raped so many times. And her sister came to them, and she had 2 children, but she had completely lost her mind. She just fled and left the children. So poor Mary, at age 21, had to take care of her mother, 4 children eventually, and with no job. So she began to sell her body until she found Solace Ministries, and I'll stop there for that. So everything that was done to humiliate and degrade people. The 2 other things we did as far as interview, one was several people wanted us to go. These are some of the more courageous people that maybe were a little more healed, to go with them to the killing sites of how they survived. That was something. That was just, like a movie that's being played for the first time, because most of them had not gone back. This young man, for example, the church that Arpi mentioned, he was in that church. He showed us exactly the 3rd pew where he was sitting when the killers came. He also fell down like Mary, and there were all sorts of bodies on top of him. He survived. He eventually got up. He showed us all of that. Then he took us to another place on top of a hill and showed us a huge swamp. He said for a month, he survived with others in that swamp, with snakes, with every kind of creature. But he said, we weren't afraid of snakes. We were afraid of the killers who would come during the day and try to locate us. At nights, they could get out of the swamp and find a place to sleep. The last thing, and I'll end with this, is the home visits we did. After a while, we realized doing 3 interviews a day was exhausting. And really, I have to say, Don and I really were experiencing vicarious trauma. You just couldn't help to think of these women. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, thinking of my children, my grandchildren, to live with the thing that I didn't protect my children and my children were killed, sometimes in front of me. Sometimes they would rape the women in front of the children. I just won't even go to those details. It's too harrowing. But the home visits were wonderful, because when we went to their homes, they were the hosts, we were the guests. And we saw a whole different side of them, sort of the human side of them. These are people like Don and me, like you and me. And they would bring their neighbors. If they had siblings, they would introduce us. And sometimes they would give us gifts. This one woman went, and this happened more than once, something she makes for a living. She insisted that we take this basket. Our house is filled with baskets. But the one I want to end with is Mary again. Mary wanted us to go to her house. She insisted we go because her mother was very ill. and she wanted us to go and pray for her mom. So several of us, by the way, I always had that interpreter with us when we went to her house after going up all sorts of, rugged roads. Again, a little tiny, narrow place. We sat down and talked and met her children. And then we went inside the one room where they all sleep. So it's Mary, her mother, and 4 children. Mother was on a bed looking very emaciated, very sick. I think she was suffering from asthma and other ills. And there was a little tiny boy sleeping with her. So we prayed and we talked and tried to cheer them up. And then at the end, Mary said, the custom in Rwanda is that when someone comes to our house, we give them something to drink or we give them something to eat. But she said, I'm really sorry, we can't do any of that. But she said, we will honor you. And so her 8-year-old child took a rag, came around one by one, cleaning our shoes as they sang a song. You've come to visit us, to honor us. We wash your feet in gratitude. I don't think there was a face without tears at that moment, and that has forever stayed with Don and me.
Arpi is now going to talk a little bit about the experience of orphans and also the immediate aftermath when the genocide ended in July, mid-July.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So I just wanted to take a second to say, I know this is very triggering, and I know we do have some survivors on the session today listening. And even for us, having lived in this material for so long and heard these same stories and read them over and over again, we still struggle actually talking about them, reading these passages. And so just to honor that, I know it's hard to listen to. And what we tried to do in the beginning of the book is do the very difficult task of taking people through the horror of what genocide looks like, feels like, and smells like. And it wasn't for gratuitous, purposes. It was purely because you can't understand the healing processes and what comes later in the story without really understanding what this experience was like. So what I'll talk about just a bit is our work and our chapter on orphans. I worked extensively with this material on this chapter. And what we tried to do in the juxtaposition of the chapter on women's experiences and children's experiences and orphans' experiences is show that a genocide is one thing, right? It's a common experience, but where you're located, your age, if you're a mother, if you're a father, if you're poor, if you're wealthy, you experience a genocide very differently. And even though it's really in the subtleties of the interviews, you can draw out that these were young children and what that feels like from their experience. I noted earlier that my grandparents were survivors. And again, I saw their story in reading the orphan stories. The one, my grandfather was saved by enemies, was taken into a Turkish home by enemies. And we see that experience of the children fleeing and going to their Hutu neighbors, sometimes without understanding the political context of what was happening and hoping they might find relief there, sometimes finding it and often not. On the flip side, my grandmother was saved because at about 6 or 7 years old, her mother did exactly what my mom was just saying, sent her on her own, put her in a caravan to Aleppo, and just as a little tiny girl, just pushed her out and said, be saved. I've always struggled with that because it feels like such an abandonment. And we feel that in the story of the children over and over again, this idea that this is for your own good, but in the moment that you most need your parent, in the most horrifying crisis of your life, that all the adults around you would send you by yourself out into the world to try to survive the killers and survive by finding food, water, and all those things is really a difficult thing. And I think for myself, working through this material, this level of understanding of how difficult the decisions were for parents, how in such short amount of time they had to make strategic decisions just like that and decide how to separate and what that felt like as a child. And I think my mom spoke about it a little bit, but these separations were strategy. They were a true strategy. And as she said, the men felt if they left, they would, the wives and the children would have a better chance of surviving. And what happened, similar to many genocides, is all the men were killed first, and then the women and the children were left more defenseless. With the women and the children, just as my mom was saying, there was this feeling that the mothers with infants and toddlers were slow, and they would handicap in some way the older children. And when I say older, I mean 5, 6, and 7 years old. They're not old children. They're very, very little children, but they can run and they're fast. And so we saw in the children's stories this kind of bifurcated experience. The thing that holds them all together is, in our sample, they were orphaned. So at some point in their trajectory, they were alone. There were no parents with them, right? But that happened differently for different people in the sample. So some were that case where they were sent out and the parent said, go and take your little siblings and go into the fields. And there's this, you can feel, it's from a child's perspective, they were very obedient. My mom said to do this, and I don't know what this context is. I think we're in a war. And they just kind of marched out into the field, sometimes with these little siblings, that then they were going to have to figure out how to hide and feed. The flip side was the experience of those who did stay with a parent for a period of time. And the most difficult, and again, this is very triggering, but the most difficult experiences for the children. And when they would break down and cry in interviews, and this was often peer-to-peer, being interviewed by their own peers, was that they witnessed the killing of their parents. And what was harder was they often witnessed that killing from a little distance. They were hiding, but they could see what was happening to a parent. They could hear, and what they couldn't do, and what was so traumatic, was they couldn't help, and they couldn't yell, they couldn't cry, they couldn't make any noise where that would reveal where they might have been hiding with a sibling. And so people continued to talk about that experience, and a very similar, I would love to read passages, but I can tell we're going over time, so I'm not going to, but was this idea of hiding amongst dead bodies, let's say, watching a mother being raped and then killed, maybe with the infant sibling, and then waiting till dark and then going to the body, finding the body. And in some cases, one that I was just reviewing again recently, finding an infant alive and taking that infant and putting that infant on one's back as a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, and then trying to do some kind of ritual to bury the body or put a cloth over the body. Sometimes that wasn't possible because of wild animals and a lot of details, again, I won't go into. But what was similar in both these cases, whether the kids were sent out alone or they survived with a parent for a period of time and then they watched that parent be killed, was that, again, the people that were most supposed to accompany them, help them, the elders of the society, were not there to protect them, and they had to go out and survive. And that survival is really multifaceted. Obviously, there's the survival of escaping the killers. So just the horror of just constantly hiding, like Mom was saying, hiding in the swamps, hiding in the forests, hiding in the fields, or going to a Hutu neighbor or a Hutu relative that had married into the family, maybe getting relief for a couple hours and then being sent out, and we can't keep you here. And the other piece was doing all that while taking care of siblings. Then trying to survive. So, I mean, we see all the pictures of every genocide. What you always see is how emaciated survivors are. And this was 90 days of not just trying to evade the killers, but finding something to eat in the wild, finding water. And so many stories of licking drops of rain off of leaves, and then surviving the cold, the rain, the bug bites, and malaria set in for many of these children towards the end of the 90 days. We do go into a lot of detail about hiding strategies and things like that, but I think to close out this chapter on children, I just want to say that there were so many little things in the interviews that remind you how young these children are, and to try to think about that, about what that must have been like as such a small child. So a lot of that was bound up in their memories of the last words that their parents said to them before they sent them out. And they were many things, but, never forget who you are, stay together, listen to God. Very sort of horrifyingly, if you're going to be killed, die together. in company of each other. And then just the tiny things, which as a mother myself, I always find sometimes the most moving, which were just things like a mom totally powerless in a situation, sending her kids out and just saying, buckle your coat, don't forget to put on your sweater. You know, it's just like what you had control over in that moment. We also heard a lot of stories sprinkled throughout the women's interviews and the children's about the innocence of the children. They had experienced discrimination for many years. They had, you know, also understood they were in a war, a civil war to some degree, but they didn't understand the context of the killing. They didn't understand why they were being targeted at all. These were their neighbors. They had gone to school together, you know? And so it's just devastatingly, one of the things we heard were things like, as people were being lined up to be killed, was children crying out totally out of context and saying, I promise I won't wet my bed again, just not understanding why they were being targeted. Or, you know, children saying things like, I promise, I swear to never be a Tutsi again, not understanding, you know, that this is an identity that was not of their choosing, right? And so those pieces, both for me working on this chapter, reminded me of how difficult the decisions were as parents. I now understand my great-grandmother, what she was trying to do, sending my grandmother away, and that did save her life. But also just a reminder of how tiny these children were. The next section I was going to talk about was the importance of understanding what happens after a genocide. I'm just checking our time. Okay. As a transition to talking about that, one of the very moving pieces of the interviews, all of them, but particularly the orphans, was that moment where they start to emerge from hiding. They start to emerge and they start to find one another. They start to find their friends. They start to find their siblings. They come out of hiding, and in their own words, and I'm just going to take a second. It's so much better if I read it in their own words, but just a few things that they said about what that felt like. We hugged each other, asking, was it you or was it your spirit? These are all different orphans saying this. My youngest sister was not able to talk. She only wept. I thought she had gone mad. When I saw her, I just fell down and wept, and she wept, and we couldn't even greet each other. We talked about our experiences, how we survived in our life during the time. We were very grieved, and it was difficult to speak. They told me the names of those who killed them, who destroyed our house. When we met for the first time, I told him how all my people were killed and how I spent my days saving my life. He also told me what happened to his people. And then I used to rejoice whenever I could meet those I knew, but immediately the problem was there. How will I live? That's the transition to the post-genocide context. And I'm going to try to make this as slim as I can, because I know we have a lot more to talk about. But what I found most compelling in my learning about genocide, working on this book, was that the definition of genocide is clear, it's concise, it's about deliberate killing. It is completely lacking in understanding what a genocide is. And what I mean by that is that methodologically, as you open up the lens from the period of the killing and the period of interviewing people way after the genocide, as they're struggling with forgiveness and looking back on that time, in between is a 20 to 30 year period. And that's when you understand what a genocide is. It's really not just about the killing. It's about the total destruction of a society. And it's as you see that that's been destroyed, and as you watch survivors try to rebuild, you really understand how many layers there are there. And I'll just list off some of those layers. It begins with the question, how will I live? For everybody. So there were the layers of the destruction of the institutions, government, schools, churches, the justice system, everything was gone. The community, your extended family, your neighbors, your neighborhood, homes were burned. All the goods were removed from the homes. There was nothing left. The cows were killed. The means of economic survival was gone. And for orphans, this was just this incredible struggle as head of households now. How will I feed my children? We have some really poignant stories about just talking about, I never expected to be a parent at 12, at 13. Now, I'll never go back to school again, because all I can think about is how I'll feed my children. And then, there are things that are linked to the body, right? The physical condition, that layer of destruction, insomnia, constant headaches, traumatic outbursts, and then missing limbs, severe bodily injuries, and for the women, HIV and the fatigue that brings. There were some more subtle things like the wisdom of an entire generation being gone. And so I was very struck in talking with orphan head of households when I visited Rwanda, that sometimes when we would say, well, how can we help? What do you need? They would say, I would expect that they needed money, a goat, something that we can use to live off of. But often the question was, could you give us some advice? And you just, again, remembering this is a child with no elders to coach them, no one to give them that advice. So I think, it was a learning experience for us having, my parents having worked on the Armenian Genocide, where it's all retrospective. And now understanding what happens in the post-genocide context is the only way you really understand what genocide is, when you bring that into view. And two of the sort of learnings that come out of that generally that lead us into the next sections are about that poverty and those physical conditions. Living in that set of conditions makes it almost impossible to heal from trauma, because every time you can't eat, everything you do, every time you have an injury and it hurts, or you're missing a leg and that makes it harder to find work, it reminds you of what was lost, and that makes it very hard to move forward. So in many ways, the first step of healing is not about trauma, it's just about meeting people's material conditions. And the second thing was that, again, until everything's stripped away, it's very hard to see, but that one of the things that is taken away in a genocide is people's social role. So that was something that women talked about a lot. They were a mother, they were a spouse, they were a great neighbor, they were a very able-bodied worker. And so there's that question that people were left with, when all that's taken away from me, who am I? And what's my purpose here? And that kind of leads us into, exploring a little bit the trauma side of things.
Thank you, Arpi. So in just a minute, Lorna is going to talk a little bit about a model of healing that we experienced. But just to summarize, trauma really was something that was so evident, and it took so many different forms. Lorna mentioned the experience of watching survivors tell their story without any emotional affect. I mean, clearly just a sign of emotional blunting. But all the classical characteristics of PTSD were observed as we interacted with survivors and in the interviewing process itself. Various forms of dissociation, intrusion, examples obviously being flashbacks, like Lorna mentioned earlier, dreams, nightmares, where people relived their experience. Another characteristic of PTSD is various forms of hyperarousal that are fear-based. Insomnia, very characteristic of survivors. The inability to concentrate, which of course had huge consequences when kids started going back to school. Examples of rage and aggression, where, and we could tell examples of that in homes that we visited. Various kinds of avoidance, but even, for example, in commemorations, and we attended both the 10th and the 20th commemoration of the genocide. At first, we wondered why there were ambulances lined up outside the stadium where the commemoration was occurring. And it was because in the midst of speeches and statements commemorating the genocide, survivors would start screaming and yelling and fainting and would have to be carried out. And then the examples of negative thoughts about oneself, guilt, blaming themselves, shame for what they experienced, particularly related to rape, the inability to be loved and to love. Now, a lot of this is detailed in the second appendix to this book that I mentioned earlier, written by our colleague, Beth Meyerowitz. And I really recommend, if you are more quantitative in your orientation, that you take a look at that appendix. But what she found, just to summarize, among the orphans as well as among the widows, was extremely high rates of individuals with headaches, stomach issues, nightmares, feeling depressed and sad and so forth. And in a national survey that was done by the Rwandan government, they found that over a quarter of the survivors, the Tutsi survivors, had manifested or were manifesting many symptoms of PTSD. Let me just end before turning to Lorna by saying that one contribution we try to make from a more humanistic perspective is we really feel that trauma in part is a function of a moral rupture that people experienced. And it occurred on many levels. It occurred, as both Arpi and Lorna said earlier, not being able to trust people that previously were friends. It also was manifested at a religious level. Where is God? And then when they witnessed their own clergy participating, if not explicitly, implicitly in the genocide, the whole sort of metaphysic of meaning, of purpose, broke down. What was amazing to us was the degree to which people oftentimes simultaneously experienced rather high levels of PTSD, but also were relatively functional, meaning they were able to manage their trauma. Lorna's going to tell us a little bit now about one example of a healing community.
As Arpi said, the genocide does not end when the killing ends. The consequences of genocide, excuse me, last lifelong. Therefore, excuse me, healing is a lifelong process. There is no such thing that next week I will be healed, next year I'll feel better. It's a lifelong struggle and process. And we've had the opportunity to be very well acquainted with an organization called Solace Ministries. We met the founder from the beginning. And something he said when he first survived and went on the streets to look around, he said, I saw people like ghosts walking around, dazed, confused, complete blank faces, orphans all over the place. He said, what I realized is physically they are alive, but internally they are empty. You could say internally they are dead. The need, the psychological need was so great afterwards, as was just the survival, which people first think about the survival before they can even deal with their emotions. He kept wondering, what am I going to do to help? Because he survived, fortunately, with his children and his wife, but his whole clan side of his family was killed. He was a person of faith, and he kept hearing this Isaiah verse in the Old Testament, comfort, comfort my people. He said, maybe that's what I need to do. So he gathered a small group of women and let them tell their stories. And he said, we all told our stories and we cried. We told our stories and cried. The following week, they came back again and they brought friends from 8 to 20, then to 50, and people started coming. And over the years, since 2001, we have had the privilege of seeing the development and growth of Solace Ministries. And they have come up with some very basic ways to help people reintegrate back into a community, into relationships from their total isolation. And that's especially women didn't want to see anyone. They were living completely isolated and they just couldn't come back to become, like they say, human again. So what they did, what Solace has done is created a loving, caring community where people can come and talk about their stories, be supported, be affirmed with love, and be listened to, and be affirmed what they went through, because the founders and the leaders of this organization themselves are survivors. They've gone through it and they know what it is. Maybe they're just a few steps ahead of these people who are just coming out of their hiding. And these meetings go every Wednesday, and Don and I have attended. I know Arpi has too, many of these services. They last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, and no one is in a hurry to go. And the whole idea is for them to just open up their hearts, to be able to tell their stories as they can. I remember the very first time I went, the woman got up and said, she could hardly talk. She said, I was raped by every man in my community and in my city. And she sat down. That's all she could say. Another woman got up and just sang a song. That's all she could do. Anyway, as these people keep coming back together again, they form really good bonds. And many of the survivors that I interviewed from this group would say Solace has become like a family to me. They take care of my needs. The mothers I lost, there are women here who act like my mother. I lost my siblings. There are other youth here who can be my siblings. And this idea that Solace has become a family was really very interesting to me. It showed the bond and the care and the love that they experienced there. Well, that's part of it, is to help people re-engage re-engage in a community and as a way of carrying their burdens. The other side of it is tremendous material needs. And so we found that Solace is very need-based. So they immediately learned early on, people didn't have homes, no shelter, no food, no clothing. The kids started going to school. They didn't have the supplies because they were orphans, so forth. And so working with other organizations of raising money, they started meeting these needs, building homes and so forth. And in time, they realized that this need has to be long-term, meaning we need to help people become self-sufficient. So then they started years later training women in different trades. For example, there was a nice big field, a farm. They called it a demonstration farm, where women would come learn to plant seeds, grow and harvest them. And they gave each of them a little plot. Others learned, were given cows so they could milk the cow. One of the women told me when we went to their house, the first thing she showed me, she had no one. Everybody had died in her family, her cow. And she had named her cow Hope. That was so sweet. And goats and so forth. And so in time, people started becoming more self-sufficient and could function on their own. So two needs were being needed. One was integrate them back into society by supporting them psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. And the other was providing material needs that could be long-lasting. This is a faith-based organization, but non-denominational, and they make a very important point that we are not a church, because they know what church meant during the genocide. So they even welcome Muslim women, even though it's a Christian organization. And a lot of the message, let me just say a couple of things about this Wednesday meeting, because it really describes how they deal with the emotions of these people. They start with singing. They allow the people to just sing their hearts out. And Mama Lambert, who's one of the leaders of this group, said that when you sing your tears away. It's a way of relieving your heart. Then, of course, they always welcome newcomers, so everybody feels part of the group. Then they give time for prayer. Get up and whatever you want to say to God, this is the time to do it. Some people told us in their loneliest moments, the only thing they could do was talk to someone, and God was the only one there to talk to. And then they also make clear that that love that they tell these people, God's love, has to be tangible in the way they love the people and people love each other. Anyway, so after that prayer, this is the fun part, is dancing. A little boy or a girl starts doing some kind of rhythm on a drum, and everybody jumps up, wounded or not, crippled or not, with canes, and they are just dancing their hearts out. You watch their faces. They're just in a different world, from the youngest ones to the oldest. One who was on the floor when we interviewed her, slithering, showing us how she was crippled, and she was slithering on the streets like a snake, was up there with her cane, just dancing away. So that, again, is a way of thanking. That's their thankfulness. And then finally, someone gives a message. And again, it's always upbeat, always, that no matter how much you were stomped on, how much you were degraded, just know this, that your value and your worth to God is the same. You're valuable, you're a loved person, of child. And then, of course, they have time at the end to sing again, and a lot of just visiting, hugging each other, and so forth. So many times, Don and I were asked to get up and speak as well. So those meetings really have become very significant part of this organization. They have grown from one room where we first met to now several facilities. In fact, because travel is so hard in Rwanda, they've developed 60 communities throughout the country where people now meet on their own, support each other, and even get microloans and do a project together for fundraising and so forth. So, this is not to say that one-on-one counseling is not important. And Mama Lambert and John Gakwandi do plenty of that, because some women simply cannot tell their stories in public. So they're all day long meeting with people. And it's not to say that group therapy or individual therapy is not, those are extremely important. But given a situation where the need was so great, a loving community like this, we have really seen the women coming alive. We have really seen the progress of women and orphans, particularly the orphans who were given scholarships to go to university. It was a complete life changer for them. And I'll just stop there because I know we don't have time.
Okay, I see there are a lot of questions. And so I think Arpi, Lorna, and I will take a minute each to wrap up, and then we'll go to some Q&A. So in my wrap up, I think the only thing I'll say is that we haven't made our way through the book. There's quite a long chapter on forgiveness. And the main thing I would say in that chapter that is emphasized is that forgiveness is a process. It's not a one-stop, one-act thing. And there are many, many barriers to forgiveness. And maybe chief among those barriers is that many of the survivors actually don't even know who the perpetrators, the rapist, were. Either they were raped by so many people, they can't identify them, or on the other hand, a lot of this killing occurred in churches in sort of mass killings, and so so it's not clear who they could forgive, since they don't even know who the perpetrator was. There's also a chapter that deals with what's called the gacaca courts, that deals more at the legal level. And so if you're interested, this is very parallel at some levels to the Truth and Reconciliation. And then there's sort of a wrap-up chapter. So Arpi, what are the chief takeaways you see from this book? And then Lorna will give you the last word, and then we'll open to some Q&A.
Okay, I'll try to do my best. So those sections on forgiveness and justice and reconciliation, I actually see a lot of questions about that. So maybe we didn't get to really spell those out, but maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. It's such a complex and dense book and set of experiences. So we just tried to pull out at the end, here are a few takeaways. I think in a lot of ways, this type of book raises more questions than answers. It's like, here's something that we're seeing. Now, someone could go and take that one point of the 7 takeaways and do a whole book on that, right? But I think there are some important methodological points in studying genocide. I see questions about, interviewing peer-to-peer, insider-outsider. We can go over some of that later, but one of them is the debate of genocide scholars about how much of the killing and horror do you show in a book. And for us, it felt important because these later sections don't make sense. They actually don't make sense unless you understand really what it felt like to go through this experience. So that was a tough choice for us. We have had friends who said it's very hard to get through chapters 1 through 3. And we knew that. So that was a methodological choice in the layout of the book and even in the interviewing itself. I think another takeaway, a huge one for all of us, is that in order to understand genocide, just, to bring this home again, you have to open the lens and understand this post-genocide process and context, because it's only that way that you wrap your head around what genocide really is. However we change our formal definitions, that's how you understand genocide. And part of that's because, there's a lot of methodology around studying extreme cases. And when you study extreme cases, are they applicable to other situations? And I think what an extreme case shows in this type of work is that it's until everything's stripped away and you watch people trying to rebuild, there's so many things in mundane daily life we take for granted, and those become suddenly very visible. Our bonds, trusts, social roles, the way our identity is tied to that, the way that facilitates our sense of purpose. And I think one of our hopes is that this won't be a book that has just insights and findings for other genocide contexts. I mean, I do hope that, but I think there's a hope that anyone going through some type of trauma or violence, or a cancer survivor, or someone who has had their body, their able-bodiedness taken away from them, that this would be some of the healing lessons might be transferable, and just some of those key points. Let's see, I think also, just to be a little brief here, focusing on the point of view of the survivor. Is it a child? Is it a male? Is it a female? Those are just such different experiences, and that's an important piece of the study of genocide. And then, in terms of the roles of religion, that idea that it can play the two sides, both be complicit in the killing, and what my mom was saying about how important that relationship and talking with God was for survivors when they had no one else to talk to. It was an intimate, personal, familial relationship to be able to lay one's burdens down. And so there's an interesting kind of bifurcation of the role of religion. And I think the other points, unfortunately, we didn't get into them too much, but there are questions raised, more questions than answers. Memorials, commemorations, gacaca trials, are those for the survivors, or are they for the broader society and the world? That's a question ethically we grapple with, because they really were troubling for the survivors, and they are still. They're sort of necessary and sometimes troubling. So I just put it out there as a question. The question of forgiveness, is it for the oppressor or is it for the victim? We found very much it's for the victim. And so there's kind of the reversal of some of these questions. And then I think, just to end on the point about healing, is that there is the need in a situation where there's poverty and it's hard to access formal psychological care and counselors, just that community that accepts that post-genocide woman, right, as she is in that moment, with her post-genocide body, with illnesses and disabilities, that goes so far, even when she cannot accept herself, that the community can accept that new self, and within that she might find a new role for herself. And as she finds a new role for herself, she may be able to begin her healing journey. There's more I can say, but I'll stop there.
And my concluding remarks is that these 20 years of experiencing our dear friends, we now call them our Rwanda home, has really helped me better understand the Armenian survivors in an interesting way. You know, we heard their stories, we lived with them, but that immediate aftermath, that trauma, thinking of the child, thinking my parents as orphans, I hadn't thought that much about it, but it really helped me appreciate what they went through. Trauma wasn't in our vocabulary in those days. And then also, it really made me appreciate the orphanages and the loving people who took these orphans in who had no one else and gave them a life. It was similar to the Solace Ministry, reintegrate them into a community, a loving community. So that's been extremely helpful to me. And at the same time, because I have this, you know, I see what's happened, how the Armenians, they made it. Those who survived made it. I can be helpful to Rwandans by saying, look, I survived. My parents had 7 children. My father lost 7 siblings, had 7 children. At one point when I said that, they broke out in applause. So, you know, give them a little bit of hope. And then finally to say that several of the people we have really kept close, even we don't go back, we email with them continually, especially some of those AOCM orphans. I go back to Naftal, and I'm going to end with Naftal. Naftal said to us recently that, you know, trauma is still with us, especially when we have children or when we're getting married. We remember what we're missing. But he said, now we can manage our trauma. And we were in Rwanda when he had his first child. It was a little girl. We were in the hotel. He came running, breathless, said, you've got to come. Francine had the baby. You've got to come to the hospital. So Donna and I dashed with him. We went to the hospital, and there we saw Francine with the little baby in her arms and beginning of a new generation. It was such a happy moment. And a little bit later, they told us with such pride that they had named their little girl Arpi. And Arpi is an Armenian name, our daughter, Arpi. And it means the early sun rays, sunshine in literature. And so Naftal said, even though we've been devastated, our families are crushed and so forth, little Arpi has brought sunshine into our lives. So I end that there's truly a lot of evil in human beings, but there's tremendous resilient spirit in human beings as well. Thank you so much for sticking with us throughout this thing. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much to all of you. This was such a personal approach to the webinars, and I think it really humanizes the experience of genocide, and that's a comment that has been throughout in the Q&A as well. So I think everyone felt that, and we really appreciate you sharing these stories and your experience working on this book. As you mentioned, there are quite a few questions. So what I'll do is I'll try to get through as many as we can. And if we don't get to some, I'll copy them down and maybe send you an email, and maybe we can try to address some of those by email if we can't get to all of them, but I'll give it a try. So our first one is, it's really interesting that children themselves interviewed their peers. Can you speak to some of the strengths of this approach? And is there a better cultural understanding by doing it this way?
So I'll tackle that a little bit. You know, when we first went to Rwanda, we had no intention of writing a book. Actually, we were sick of the topic of genocide. And so this idea was, oh, we could, you know, maybe make a charitable contribution or something. Then we came up with the idea that since we did have some funding that had been given to us without any strings attached, that they might have interest in interviewing, you know, their fellow orphans, which, as Lorna described, they did. Now, so in a sense, they did the interviewing almost by default. We had no intention of starting a new project ourselves, but they wanted a historical record of their own experience. Now, we did vet with a umbrella organization of survivors called Ibuka, which means remember, an interview guide that we developed with AOCM members. And it was sort of given official sanction. The advantage, I suppose, is that these were orphans interviewing each other. And so the issue of trust was there. Whereas it might have been much more difficult for old people like ourselves who were white to have done the interviews. So I think that was the advantage. The disadvantage is the interviews were not as systematic as certainly we were when we were interviewing the Solus survivors. Also, the equipment was not as good. We were using relatively inexpensive tape recorders, whereas we used a professional video camera when we did the interviews. So I think, pluses and minuses.
Thank you very much for that. There was also another question about transitional justice efforts and rebuilding efforts that was asked. And I think a few different questions, so maybe I'll try to sum it up into this one, about kind of the reconciliation and transitional justice efforts after the genocide. And if you could maybe expand on some of what you've seen in your experience there.
Yeah, well, I'll tackle that again, but Arpi and Lorna jump in.
Mm-hmm.
So after the genocide, one of the problems was there were 100,000 perpetrators in prison. And so there was a need to just deal with, in a small country, that many people in prison. So the very first conference that we went to, there was an emerging discussion about using a village justice system of gacaca, which literally is sort of justice on the grass. And so just to say a little bit about that process, because I attended one of these gacaca courts, is that there would be prisoners that would be brought who had participated in a particular killing. And in the case where I observed, there was also a surviving relative. And so the prisoners gave testimony as to what had occurred. One was extremely apologetic. And by the way, these testimonies were extremely graphic also. And at the end of the prisoners making their apologies, just even as an outsider, it was clear to me that the apologies in many instances were just being given so they could get out of prison. And but nevertheless, at the end, the surviving relative, as almost a legal requirement, was required to say, "I forgive you." Now, one thing that we heard repeatedly in our interviews, because we asked about gacaca, was that many survivors did not feel that there was sincerity in the apologies. This was like a get out of jail card. And also in the gacaca courts, oftentimes they were supposed to make recompense, in the form of money or giving back property or land or whatever the case. Survivors repeatedly told us that did not occur. But I think the bigger issue is, what if you were in the leadership of a country? One problem that the president, Paul Kagame, had to solve was, how do you bring a perpetrating group together with a victim group? So one of the solutions to this current day is that you do not make distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi. Instead, all are Rwandese. Now, under the surface, there are currently still tensions, but that's at least the stab at what is a very complex issue that is currently ongoing. And in some ways, it takes perhaps a rather authoritarian government to try to keep in check what would be tensions that otherwise could exist between a minority and a majority group.
I'll just add, one thing as a sociologist that I found really interesting in the material is, unlike the Armenians who were displaced from their homeland and their native lands, this is that complex situation where people have not been deported or removed. They're living literally as neighbors still. And I found there was a question that asked about this. There's something that I think we began to call something like the performance of normality. A lot of the survivors talked about, we know they killed our people and they know we put some of their people in prison. And we pass each other on the street and there's pain in the fact that they never said to me, I'm so sorry what happened to your spouse and that your children were killed. And in some cases, the neighbor participated in it. So there's pain in that, but there's also this question of how do we coexist? So is it better if we call each other out and we create conflict, or do we just say, oh, how are you doing today? The weather is, it's been awfully rainy. And do we just perform normality? Because again, it's what is for the healing of the individual and what's for the society to heal and move forward. And those are different levels of reconciliation and healing. And so even this gachacha very much being a performance, like Dad was saying, of, a lot of people just saying, yeah, I forgive you because we just need to move forward. But that inside then feeling like that didn't feel right. I don't forgive you. I'm really angry. So I think, there's a question about how does a society move forward? What is the right answer there? And what works for the individual isn't the same as what works for a larger community. And I think, again, it almost just raises the question more than provides the answer.
Yeah, in the chapter on forgiveness, we have a typology, and what Arpi just referred to in gachacha, we call that transactional forgiveness. In a sense, you do not have a choice. If apology is made, however insincere, then there's sort of the mandate that you forgive. We also have in our typology a category that we call pragmatic forgiveness. It's sort of like we just have to get along. And so there's some sort of reframing that is done in order to move forward. And I would also say repeatedly survivors talked about the good of the country as opposed to just themselves. And so for the good of the future, the good of the country, we must move ahead and let bygones be bygones.
Thank you so much for that. We do have someone who has their hand raised, Kunsoli. So I'm going to allow her to talk so she can ask her question out loud. And I'm just asking you to unmute. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, good to hear from you.
So wonderful to hear your discussion. Thank you very much for the work you did. I really, really appreciate that. As a genocide survivor, it really means a lot to hear everything you said, and it's really exactly right. So, and I really appreciate, because people should read your book to learn more deep about us, because not everybody understands how we think. So, and it's important to really read and understanding that. So, and I just wanted to thank you very much. And I always have a discussion with my fellow survivors about our lives, and some of us tell our stories. I'm one of those people. I go around and share my story. I wrote about it. So, and especially my generation, because I was a teenager. So we always have a discussion of how, many of us still go through a lot of deep trauma and so many different ways. I have friends, we have discussions. I became almost like one of their counselors, so, because I went through therapy here. So now I understand how to, to talk is very important. So, and I really appreciate what you're doing. And I think, when we tell stories, it's important also to highlight also that the journey of healing is still, there. So, and the trauma is still alive, even though the country is great, we thrive in so many areas. So, like you said earlier, like you were mentioning, like we tend to like to talk about how the country is great. So we forget to talk about our trauma. So it's important to talk about that too. So, yeah, so I just wanted to thank you, and hopefully I will be able to meet all of you. And yeah, so and you're welcome to our commemorations. We are organizing some of them, and so hopefully we can keep talking about this and having, you know, survivor stories, you know, be heard. So yeah, so just want to thank you. I don't want to take the time, so hopefully we'll be able to talk again.
So Constantly, where are you located?
I live in New York City.
New York City. Okay.
Yes, I live in New York City, and I've been here almost 18 years. So, but I've lived in Rwanda throughout my, you know, life after the genocide. I was born in the western province of the country, in Kibuye. I don't know if you've been there. So,
oh yes,
that's where I survived the genocide. I survived with my mom and my sister. We were 5 of us in our household. So I was the oldest. I was 14. So, and my dad was killed, and my 3 younger brothers. So, and many of our big families on both sides. So, but I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful you're telling our stories, and I'm so thankful to be here. That the main reason I also speak is because I realize many of us are not telling our stories, and I share some of the stories that I think are very hard for survivors to talk about, especially rape. So, which is something you realize is hard for many women to talk about. And yeah, so some of them started sharing a little bit since I shared. So, and that was the main purpose also. So,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Console. And your courage in telling your story and giving that courage to other people to tell their story is so important. People always ask us, you know, is there something about going and telling the testimonies of people and telling it to the world that it feels like you're stealing their story? And what we found is that most survivors we've talked to that were interviewed said, when at the end we say, is there something that you'd like us, the world, to know? They've said, tell our story.
Absolutely, absolutely. What you did is very important, and many of the survivors are not like me to tell the stories on their own. They need someone like you to help them. So absolutely. And what you did is important, and I'm truly grateful for you. Thank you very much.
Take care. Okay. Arpi, this next one is for you. They would love to know more about your thoughts on the disconnect between the Genocide Convention and what genocide actually is. And what are the things the study of genocide needs to consider?
Well, I'll say my parents are more genocide experts than I am. So I'm just a humble sociologist that sees things through a sociologist's view. So they may want to answer, but I think that it is so easy for the outside world to think, okay, that genocide is over. That, you know, the genocide, like we were saying, it doesn't end when the killing ends. And it's not just about the reconciliation process. To understand, we just have to open our lens. And I think it's, you know, by virtue of when interviews have been done, when we've had access to do interviews with survivors, the methodology and the timing of our interviews and the sample affects how we define the phenomenon sometimes. And I think that for us, it's just been important to let the world know when a genocide ends and the killing ends, the genocide's impact is so ongoing. And if we ended our stories with the killing and just the interviews to that point, our understanding of this phenomenon would be, I mean, I don't even know where to begin, a fraction of our understanding of how a genocide impacts a society. So I don't know what it means in terms of changing formal definitions or anything like that, but in the scholarship around genocide, if we can just keep bringing this thinking forward and making sure our methodologies are in sync with the broader study of the impact of genocide, I think that'd be really important. I don't know if Mom and Dad want to add something to that.
Well, the only thing I would add is we don't actually deal with the International Tribunal because actually our survivors didn't talk about it very much. And if anything, there was some hostility towards it. For one thing, why couldn't it be held in Rwanda? Why did it have to be held in Tanzania? How could you spend $1.5 billion and only convict 93 people and so forth? But one thing that did come out of it is that the category of rape is now very much front and center as an element in the definition of genocide. And I think that's principally because of the Rwandan experience, where rape was, as Lorna said, I think very well, I mean, it was an act of humiliation. And it wasn't a single rape. In many, many cases, it was multiple rapes. And one of the things that so many survivors told us about the ongoing consequence of genocide is that they are living with HIV. And actually, early on, many of the survivors were dying of HIV. And then antiretroviral drugs sort of became much more available. So many survivors are now living relatively healthy lives, but still under the burden of the certain kind of diet that they have to have and so forth. And also, I mean, there are tragic stories from our survivors of them actually then infecting a partner with HIV and so forth. So, so I think rape ends up being, you know, one of the legacies at an international level. There's more awareness of it in the context of genocide.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. I do have, I skipped down a few. So this next question is, what do you as researchers do to practice self-care and working in stressful environments like this? Because you did mention kind of the impact that conducting these interviews had on you. They finish by saying, so more work can be done to help survivors. So what are some of the ways you take care of yourself when you do some of these oral history interviews and collect these testimonies?
Well, I'll start with when I was doing the Armenian Genocide. I was a lot younger, and I would be so speechless because, you know, in that genocide, they're my people. So there was that feeling. And as I said, my children were the age of the survivors during the time of the genocide. The only thing I could do is I would come home, put on my jogging shoes and run for hours just to process. With the Rwanda, I had real insomnia. I just could not sleep at nights. I mean, it was so traumatizing because I carry both a secondary trauma, what came down from my parents, and there I was experiencing vicarious. So, you know, a lot of meditation, a lot of prayer. Again, Don and I would, after each our morning sessions, would go for a long walk, try to process it. But the advantage in this case we were coming home to our children, to our grandchildren, to our comfortable home, you know, and that was support enough itself. We knew that, you know, I had to completely divorce myself. I'm not going through the genocide. I'm listening to the story. That's not my grandchild. You know, I had the help of Dr. Meyerowitz that Don talked about, our colleague. She really helped me in how to say, stop yourself by putting yourself in that shoes of that person. But by and large, I would say just going home to a comfortable home and have time to process it in a very clean, peaceful neighborhood, home, and so forth.
I want to give an example. The very first time we went to Rwanda, we were with a group of people internationally, and there was a psychiatrist from Bosnia. And as a group, we went to a clinic that serviced survivors, all women who were HIV positive, and some were quite sick. And I remember that psychiatrist saying to the staff of the clinic, she actually asked it as a question. She said, "What are you doing to take care of yourselves?" And she then said, "You are going to burn out if you don't take care of yourselves. You can't continue unless you are doing things that are joyful, that give you a different perspective on life." And so I think that was so wise of that woman. And that was based on her experience as being a psychiatrist in Bosnia.
And she was a survivor herself. Her husband was killed.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Wow. Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. I also skipped down a little ways. How did the social unit or family change after the genocide? And how were family roles defined or reconfigured when you were collecting these testimonies? Did you come across anything like this?
Well, I'll answer very shortly, but I think that's more a question for Arpi and Lorna. Well, first of all, and there was a reference to this earlier, but these orphans were sometimes caring for younger siblings, and they themselves were not even teenagers yet. They were children. These were children caring for children. And one of the things that I think it just affected us deeply is that some of those older siblings, by older I still mean, preteen or early teen, they said, "We cannot go to school because someone has to be able to make enough money to feed our children." And to have orphan children referring to their children, that is just wrenching. So the family unit, I think, and one has to ask, what impact has that had on these children that have now grown up to have been raised by their siblings? But I don't know, Arpi, Lorna, what would you say?
Talking with Naftal particularly, Naftal has become like a son to us, so we talk to him very freely. Now that he has his children, he is trying to understand how he's going to raise his children in a country where there are perpetrators and so forth, and there are these commemorations. What is he going to pass on to his children? That was very troubling for him. And in fact, once we were in the car with him and his wife and some of the kids were in the car, somehow this issue came up. Immediately the kids started asking, little Arpi, wait, what are you talking about? Tell us. And I could see mom and dad looking at each other. How do we explain this to our children in a way that we don't pass on the anger, that we feel, the trauma that we feel? So that, that was an issue that a lot of newlywed young people who, like Don said, were AOCM members, orphans taking care of siblings. Now they were taking care of their own children who had not gone through the genocide. And how are they going to talk about that with them? That was a very big issue, and they're still dealing with.
I think there's lots of ways to think about the question, but just some reflections from what we saw in the interviews were the widows many times saying, now I must be mother and father. And in a society where those were very distinct roles, being that breadwinner and taking care of the children, that surfaced a number of times. The idea that orphans became parents at 12 surfaced over and over again. But another thing I think that happened is that widows adopted children, either formally or totally informally. So where they lost all their children and lost the feeling of that role, they readopted it by bringing children, and this often women that had nothing, they just had so little themselves, but they saw that the children had absolutely no one to care for them. So they became sort of the mother hen of a group of children. We saw that a lot in Solace ministries. And also, I would just say that, you know, there are two ways that the immediate family changed. One is that as the orphans grew and married, a lot like my grandfather and my grandmother, they found other survivors.
Mhm.
And in that survivor, with that survivor, they became the new family unit. Even though the generation above them was lost, they rebirthed that traditional family unit. And that's happening all over. And those children are now, you know, 12, 13 years old themselves. And also the orphan head of households and the women, widows and solace, they made family with each other. So the orphan head of households, they didn't live in isolation. They became a village. They were like co-parents.
Mhm.
Even literally they built homes. Homes were built, you know, by different NGOs where they could live in a village and
Mhm.
sort of co-parent together. And same with the widows. I think as particularly in Solace ministry, it was sort of like, as I was saying, you know, will the community accept this new post-genocide woman? That became her new family. The other family was no longer, she was rebirthed as a new member of this particular family of women and the leaders in Solace. And so I think that's sort of how I've seen family recreated.
Just one vignette. One of the women who ended up adopting something like 10 children, she was actually trained to be one of the judges in the Gacaca trial. So she was a very sophisticated woman. She said she had a baby she was nursing at the time of the genocide. The baby died. She said, I was still lactating and I found a baby who was completely left. And I took that baby and I nursed that baby.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. I think we'll do one more question and then I'll try to copy down the rest of the questions. I've been working on it as I go, so maybe we can address some of those at a later date. But the first one here on our list, has there been any self-critical assessment by the Catholic Church of its role in the genocide?
Okay, well, I'm going to hold up a book that I recommend on this topic. And it's by Timothy Longman, and it's called Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda. And so this is 300 pages on exactly that topic. And I recommend it as an excellent scholarly book. But I think as most issues like this, it's a yes and no.
Mhm.
There continues to be a fair amount of denial, and if not denial, ignoring the issue by Hutu clergy and by the church itself. And denial is always tinged with guilt, I think. And so I think the Catholic Church has some self-examination that it needs to do on this issue.
I'll add one thing. Many of the survivors were Catholic, but after the genocide, they completely stopped going to Catholic churches and went to other churches. Many of them went to Pentecostal churches or non-Catholic. They simply could not step back in a Catholic church.
Right. Well, I would like to thank you very much for this really, really fascinating presentation. I wish we could get to all the questions and we could stay another hour, but we will wrap up now. So thank you to Donald Miller, Lorna Touryan-Miller, and Arpi Miller for this incredible presentation. And thank you to our participants for joining today and for your wonderful questions. As a follow-up, this was recorded, so we will circulate the recording to those who attended, and we'll also try to address some of the questions there as well. We have a webinar taking place next week, as I mentioned at the beginning. So again, it's on Tuesday at 2 p.m. and we'll be discussing gender and international responses to genocide with Grant Shubin. So please register for that one and we look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.